So, where were you this past week when the notice flashed up on our phones, on our computers, on our radios, or TV that the jury had reached a verdict in the Derek Chauvin George Floyd murder trial? Let us know in the chat box. I was in the home office, that's where I am today, working on guest speakers for a class I'm teaching next month for the MBuzz. When I saw the notice pop up, I literally fell back in my chair. My pulse quickened. My eyes raced around the room. It would be another hour before we knew. I was completely distracted. What was racing through your mind? I wondered where George's daughter was and whether that amazing poise and courage we had seen could sustain her through this. As Mavis Staples sung in our opening piece, we had all seen with my own eyes. All of America had seen with my own eyes. I wondered what it would mean for America and how we would move forward as a country. And now, as business leaders, how we should respond. I knew whatever the verdict was, it surely would be laced with profound sorrow. A man was dead, a country was grieving. And across the country, and often in our own families, we had yet to share a clear consensus on a way forward. Little did any of us know that 15 minutes before the guilty verdict was announced, in this case, that responding to a fight at a foster home in Columbus, Ohio, a police officer had shot dead Makia Bryant, a 16-year-old Black girl. With multiple cameras on it, we could also see it with my own eyes. Today, as we celebrate our shared and proud history of Hawes, I am humbled by the task of leading us through a reflection on the riots, the killings, the pandemic, and what it means for us as business leaders and as Americans, including some of the larger implications. I have to say that when I discovered, after accepting this speaking invitation, note to self, read the small print, that the session was 75 minutes, the task became even more daunting. So I decided to break the talk up into three acts, much like the playwright I once aspired to be. So I decided to both break the talk up into these three acts, but also to encourage you into the conversation. For what I know for sure is that ordinary people are capable of extraordinary things, capable of extraordinary thoughts, and capable of extraordinary deeds. And certainly you as Haas grads, students, and friends are. I will seed the conversation with some current research so we might see what employees are expecting from us as business leaders. Then you will get an opportunity to decide what to do about it. Next, in Act Two, I will step back and describe some of the mega trends underlying our conflict. I will risk being provocative and once again invite you into the conversation. My analysis is meant to catalyze a robust dialogue and debate among ourselves today. And afterwards, I encourage you to talk about these issues over lunch, over dinner, with your families, and in your faith community. The kind of dialogue we value so much in this academy, and most certainly what research shows that makes our personal, civic, and business decisions so much better. And lastly, in Act Three, I will give you a sneak preview of some of my comprehensive research that I'm about to publish that both presents a most alarming picture of America's startup future and proposes a seemingly simple but quite bold solution. One that is nothing short of announcing something on the scale of proposing to send a man to the moon and bring it back safely, when we didn't have any idea how to do that. And we certainly had none of the technology, it hadn't been invented yet. One that was like deciding to intervene in World War II, the right decision. But Lord, we didn't know how we were going to build the industrial capacity to win. And yet we did both. And they both propelled us to greater global economic, scientific, and diplomatic leadership. I believe that we have the opportunity to do both of these things again. I thank you for choosing this topic today. And now let's go. So Act 1. One of the people I thought about as I was waiting for the verdict to be announced was David Mortensen. He was supposed to be in Seattle that day as his company is building a new hockey stadium with the naming rights going to Amazon. I figured he would probably cancel his trip since the verdict was coming down. He's the chairman of a $5 billion third generation Minneapolis construction company, and certainly one of the most honorable business people I have ever known. When I checked in with him a couple months ago, and he told me that the major CEOs in Minneapolis were talking with Black leaders on how to make commitments to significantly achieve racial equity. Understandably, these conversations were hard and they were raw. I asked him what was motivating most of these CEOs. I was curious and maybe even a little skeptical. He answered quickly. The push was coming from their employees. This actually tracks with the latest research. Edelman, a global communications firm that for almost 70 years has started measuring, it's a 70-year-old firm, but for the last 20 years, it's been starting and measuring and tracking trust across issues and institutions. It's a survey that we watch really closely because we know when trust is up, we make more money as companies, our employees are happy, they take less sick leave. All good things happen when trust goes up, whether it's in the public sector and the private sector. So it turns out that in the 2021 survey that was just in the field in December of last year, that a whooping 86% of people responding said that they expected their CEO ought to speak out on one or more of societal issues. 86%. That's simply astounding. And this is actually a global finding, not just in the US. A tall order for us as business leaders, given the controversy and the range of societal issues that we are confronting. The police shootings are but one of the social issues that are front and center today. Voting rights, gun rights, or mass shootings, depending on how you look at the issue. Transgender, including bathrooms, as we saw played out in North Carolina. Dreamers and immigration or border security. Religious freedom. The list goes on. Well, using more data from the Edelman survey, let's peel open this onion a little more. And then we'll head into breakouts so you can choose which societal issues you want business leaders to take a bold leadership stance on and what specifically you want them to do. Well, it turns out that, whether you voted for President Biden or Trump, almost never do people who voted for President Biden or President Trump agree on anything, but they actually agree on one thing, and that is that they both trust their own CEO more than government officials, more than journalists, or more than any other generic CEO. It turns out that they trust them so much, or actually, I wonder if they're so desperate to get somebody to pay attention to our problems. It turns out that they trust them so much to solve what we are just hoping our CEOs will step up to. So let me show you a slide that I think is really valuable. And that is that I told you that 86% said they expected their CEOs to speak out. But this, I think, is even a more mind boggling. People in remarkably high margins, that is 68%, report that CEOs ought to actually step in when the government does not fix societal problems and not just speak out about it. And if you look all the way over to the other side, almost that number, 66%, oops, um, want them to be accountable, not just to shareholders, not just to the board of directors, but to the public. A very tall order for us as business leaders. So now it's your turn. Let me just add one other thing. The other thing they do is that I think is really powerful. They trust the company's information more than any other place they get information, more than the social media that they look at, and more than any other place. So think about that. Think about how powerful that is in the era of fake news and who should I believe. They actually believe that you tell the truth more than anybody else. So now it's your turn. For the next 5 minutes, you'll be randomly assigned to a breakout room. This isn't your time to get a cup of coffee because we need your brilliance and we can't do it without you. So here's the breakout question. What one issue? I gave a bunch of them, but you may have one that's a favorite of yours, but just pick one. Should business leaders address, and what do you specifically want them to do? No platitudes. It has to be actionable. But maybe you're part of that 14% that says, Maura, that's crazy. I don't want CEOs to do this. I don't think it makes any sense at all. So if you think company CEOs should remain silent on social issues, let your group know why and whether you think um, they would be better solved without business leaders. So we'll see you back in 5 minutes to share a great idea that you heard in the breakout. See you then. Well, welcome back. I hope that you solved all of America's problems in the last 5 minutes. But if you could type in the chat, and if you're driving, that would not be advisable. But if you type in the chat some idea that you heard from somebody else that you thought was actually useful, or if you think that you are the most brilliant person on the face of the earth, then you can just put your idea in the chat as well. But I'd love to actually have somebody unmute themselves. You can either unmute or you can raise your hand and share either something you said or something you heard that you thought was really useful. And if you could introduce yourself and say what class you're from, that would be really valuable. And people who know me from teaching know that I'm totally unopposed to, that is, I'm happy to cold call. So looks like Derek, you've unmuted yourself. So why don't you get us started? What did you hear that you thought was particularly interesting?
Hi, Maura. We talk about social injustice issues and also pay attention to climate change. I think those are very important issues.
What did people say ought to be done? So those are ginormous issues. You know, I think that most of us go to bed at night saying, my gosh, those are existential issues, incredibly important. Don't know that we as business leaders could tackle them and make a difference. So, but I think otherwise. So what in that 5 minutes did you come up with as a specific way forward?
Yeah, if I may elaborate, just for the nonprofit I'm running, we really are becoming very active in terms of looking at social injustice as a issue we need to face. It's also similar to pandemic. It has a lot of root causes. If we don't pay attention to it, then sooner or later we have a bigger problem, just like what we're facing right now. Similar to climate change, I would say. Is brewing, and a lot of people are not paying attention. But as business leaders, we need to look at how we can be part of the solution and not be part of the problem.
Okay, let's get a couple more people in here. So what did you hear that you thought was particularly interesting? So either unmute or raise your hand. Okay, so I'm not shy. I think there's a really interesting one in the chat by Akshay. Am I pronouncing your name correctly? About extended producer responsibility. Can you unmute and tell us a little more about that?
Hi, Maura. Sure, happy to do that. So we did talk about environmental stewardship on companies and focus on climate change. So one way to implement that is corporations, rather than taking ownership of only stuff till it is sold, and whatever the product that they're selling, whether it is some physical product or whether it is information or it is news or whatever, take ownership beyond just the selling, which is typically how corporations are run in these days, and really take the ownership for the entire life cycle, whether it is ownership of fake news or whether it is environmental extended producer responsibility for what they're producing through the end of life, and for physical products, even recycling, and having a plan for all of that. So that's something that we just touched upon as something that corporations could focus on.
Yeah, that's a super interesting idea. In 1990, I was involved in launching, and a few years earlier, some of the first curbside recycling programs in the country. And I remember working with the people who produced the clear plastic PET, the pop bottles, and they were wanting to sort of go into smoke-filled rooms with legislators and get the bans on their products put off. And I said, well, actually, we could do that, but that's not going to solve your problem. They actually want you to take responsibility for this product after you've sold it. And they said, Carly drinks that Diet Coke and you want me to take responsibility for that after she's drank it? Are you kidding me? And I said, well, in America alone, you're facing 800 bans on your product nationwide. I suppose that's a go forward profitable plan. And so they stepped up in a really bold way and said, okay, we will. And at the time, there was no market. No producers would retool their products to use post-consumer PET or those clear plastic bottles, because there was no assured source of supply and a price. Carly was putting it in her garbage, not in a recycling supply chain. And so they stepped up and as an industry said, we'll provide a floor price. Took about 5 years, but it then became the first post-consumer waste traded on the Chicago Board of Trade. It's a really interesting idea you all came up with. It says, take that same concept and think about it in an information age and apply it to that. So that's super cool. All right. Well, continue to put your ideas in the chat because I'm really excited to hear about them. So let's. Yeah.
Maura, I have something to add. In the space of social injustice, I was telling my small group that our nonprofit started as an all Asian-based organization back in 1972. But since then, we really have diversified, and now we have over 300 staff speaking one of the 34 languages in Sacramento. But more than that, I agree with you that as a CEO, we need to take a bold step and be a leader and speak up instead of being just a bystander. So what I've done during the past year in view of the George Floyd issue and also the recent surge in anti-Asian hate, I have been doing a lot of town hall meetings with my staff, with my community, with my board of directors, and also members from the volunteer cohort, and to give them an opportunity to talk about these issues, because a lot of times, we are viewed as, model minority, and I'm trying to break that stereotype. Has really been beneficial, and a lot of staff are getting a sense that as a president CEO, I really care about them. So they are not just hearing things from the news, from the media, but also from the top. So.
Yeah, I think that's super important. I think as much as people want CEOs to stand up and speak out, I think you're absolutely right. What we all want in our personal relationships with our spouses, with our kids, with our mothers, with our fathers, but also in our workplaces is to be heard and to be listened to. So I think you're absolutely right. That's what we first and foremost need to do with our employees is what are they expecting, and to be curious about what does that really mean. So Derek, I really appreciate that. And so continue adding stuff in chat and continue thinking about this. So let's go on to Act 2. So let's go deeper and broader on this thing we call America. I will likely say some provocative things during this act. I encourage you to join the conversation in the chat along the way by adding your thoughts. Feel free to disagree. One of the key tenets of overcoming narrow-mindedness, which was the focus of my PhD dissertation, is fostering diversity and especially dissent. And of course, if you agree or you want to expand on my thoughts, you're also invited to join the chat. So of the 7,000 languages, and I thought it was interesting, Derek, that you teed that up, of the 7,000 languages that are spoken in the world today, more than half of them are not being taught to our children. That means within a generation, they will be gone. And with them, not only a language, but a way of life, a set of traditions, of values, a culture, a rich intellectual legacy. And perhaps along with them, the solution to some of the toughest problems we are facing as a globe and a people. We will never know. In the US alone, 300 Native American languages were once spoken. Only 175 are alive today, and by 2050, only 30 are expected to survive. What might we ask? Do I care about the extinction of languages? This is a business school, after all. Shouldn't I be giving this lecture in the Department of Anthropology? For I would suggest that language, in the broadest sense, is but a marker for the cultural battle that we were embarked on in America today. And perhaps it is even a more consequential battle that we are in today than even the Civil War in the 1860s. Just think about that for a minute. Most of us are familiar with the term biosphere, particularly with the debate about climate change. The biosphere is the worldwide sum of all of our ecosystems. And of course, it's being hotly debated these days in our climate change conversations and our negotiations. Well, Wade Davis, he's an anthropologist and an ethnobotanist. He holds the inevitable title. This is a title I want in my next life, Explorer in Residence for National Geographic. And he coined the term ethnosphere. He defined it as the sum total of all the thoughts and intuitions, myths and beliefs, ideas and inspirations brought into being by the human imagination since the dawn of consciousness. He postulated that the ethnosphere is humanity's greatest legacy, a product of our dreams, the embodiment of our hopes, the symbol of all we are, and all that we, as a wildly inquisitive and astonishingly adaptive species, have created. So why do I bring this up? So let's go back to the slides. Oops. So this is a familiar and sad scene. This was January 6th. Let's try and apply these concepts of language and culture. Here's a picture of the US Capitol that day, a crowd that did not want to see the government transition to the other political party. Now let me share a short clip of what it was like to be in the Capitol that day.
Were loud, and I still felt, well, I'm in the Capitol, I'm safe, because that's what we feel. And it wasn't long before I heard explosions, I heard yelling, and all of a sudden they were in the hallway outside my door. I was inches away, along with my husband, who was with me at the time. And we were really frightened. We were hearing the announcements to stay locked down. We heard loud explosions. My husband yelled at me to get down. We were lying on the floor. And all of a sudden they were in the hall. They were yelling. They were yelling that they had breached the castle. They were yelling, "Kill the infidels." And we heard somebody saying, "We saw them. They're in one of these rooms." And they were pounding on our door and trying to open it. And my husband sat with his foot against the door, praying that it would not break him. I was not safe.
So I've watched that clip many times. I've known Senator Murray since before she decided to run for Senate. And I don't know about you, but that's not an America that I'm proud of or that I think is sustainable. So I ask myself, as I think all of us need to ask ourselves, where had all this anger and frustration from those who stormed the Capitol come from? Certainly, it had been aided and abetted by many untruths in social media and some politicians. But why, I ask, had it taken hold so hard? So let's go back to the founding of the United States of America. If you see Lin-Manuel Miranda's Most Brilliant Hamilton, or you read the dense original Federalist Papers, a book I've had on my shelf, as I have many that I've been wanting to read forever, and I finally did after January 6th. Or maybe you read the Declaration of Independence or the Constitution. You might have been gobsmacked, as I am, by the risks the founding fathers took in the grand experiment we call America. The beauty in its design, the care in which it was done. And for the 200 plus years, we welcome people to our shores and we encourage them to become citizens. Well, that's so long as they learned our language, adopted our norms, practiced Christianity, or kept their other religion mostly quiet, and agreed to our ways of doing business. It also helped if you played golf, I found, when I started business. I wasn't very good at it. It seemed logical, only there was one big problem. The rules and the norms had been set by people we call the founding fathers. It was a group of white, property-owning, Anglo-Saxon straight men. At least I think they were straight. At least they weren't out of the closet. In some cases, they were slave owners, although some of the founding fathers were adamantly opposed to slavery. And they had mostly expropriated the land holdings from indigenous people. This American model provided centuries of prosperity and freedom, at least for many, but certainly not for all. African Americans today have 1/10 of the household wealth of white Americans. The roots of this outcome were planted from this beginning. Fast forward to 2021, we now collectively, whether we call it this or not, are rethinking this model for America. And we can't agree on what this organizing principle is for being an American is. We aren't the only ones that are having this challenge. France, England, much of the Middle East, and certainly China is as well. This brings me back to Wade Davis' concept of ethnosphere. So here are some more pictures. These are some pictures that photojournalists Matthew Christopher and Regina David took of a rural and an urban America that used to provide a terrifically prosperous life for a mostly male family breadwinner who had not gone to college. This was a language, like a language, was a way of life, a set of values, norms, culture, skills, intellectual legacy that we let go extinct. Or at least we let it go on an endangered species list in most states outside of urban areas and the coastline. And for those who didn't have a college education, their language, their life is slowly evaporating. 4 million workers who lost their job during the pandemic haven't gotten it back. 2.4 million Americans who only had a community college associate degree haven't gotten their job back. 199,000 who had a bachelor's degree or higher, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics report this week, haven't gotten their jobs back. No college degrees, 20 times more likely to have not gotten your job back. This tension is unsustainable on both sides. Hamilton warned us in the 8th and the 9th Federalist Papers. He wrote that the engines of despotism that were the scourge of the old world are actually the natural course of things. All we must look at the countries all over the earth to see it. Tribal or religious factions that keep them in the state of perpetual war or even spiral into tragic genocide are actually quite common. Northern Ireland, the Balkans, Rwanda, Afghanistan, Burma are just some of the more recent ones. Madison, another founding father, continues in the next chapter of the Federalist Papers to hit the alarm buttons on violence and the peril of factions to a country's stability. He said there are two methods of curing the mischiefs of factions. The one by removing its causes, the other by controlling its effects. I believe that's the choice we are facing. As business leaders, do nothing and watch our fortunes decline. Dare to enter the arena, as Teddy Roosevelt implored us to do, to strive valiantly to remove the causes and to control the effects. I'm not suggesting that we drive America forward looking in the rearview mirror or hang on to outdated business or educational models. I am, however, suggesting that we cannot afford to leave much of America behind because it will likely only result as Hamilton and Madison predicted, in more and more factions. Perhaps, sadly, even more successful insurrections, mass shootings, and violence. All of this will result in reduced business prosperity if I put my Hawes hat on. But if I put my human suffering and demonization of American global influence, if I broaden my lens. If we aspire to be a more perfect union, which I hope all of us do, one that truly manifests certain unalienable rights, among them life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, for all, not just for men as the original authors wrote, then we must see again with my own eyes the pain and loss of families in America that have been left behind in rural, suburb, and our inner cities. Stop demonizing them if we hate their politics, fear their religion, or don't understand their sexual identity choices. Rather, seek to be more curious and seek to understand their unique gifts. For surely they have them, and we can't prosper without them. At the end of the Civil War, we didn't get this right. We just didn't. We ostensibly outlawed slavery. Instead, we ushered in Jim Crow, job and housing discrimination, and later mass incarceration to relentlessly hold on to this old order. Let's hope we get it better this time. This is not to excuse the insurrection on January 6th or racism. We still are a country built on the rule of law, and for that we can be thankful for the initial wisdom and ingenuity of the founding fathers. And now it's your turn. We're going to go into another 5-minute breakout. This time the topic is a little tougher, but I know this crowd is up for it. So your breakout question is, in order to be successful as business people in the US over the last 200 plus years, we asked you to assume the characteristics. Maybe you weren't, but we asked you to act like white Anglo-Saxon Protestant straight men. Now we're saying that there's pressure to redefine what it means to be a business leader. So your question is, what should the non-negotiable attributes of our business leaders be today? Okay, so I will see you in 5 minutes. So let's go ahead and start. So so put in the chat things that you heard either you thought up or you heard that you thought was really interesting. We'll just take a couple minutes to hear. So, and somebody could unmute if they like and see. So what kind of attributes do you want to see? So, John, what kind of attributes do you want to see in the next business leaders, or did you hear in your breakout room that you thought was particularly great?
Maura, how are you doing? Yeah, we were talking about it from the standpoint of how business leaders have a lot of pressure on them today, and how the business model has really gotten away to where you're driven by profitability, and we need to switch back where they're judged by so many other attributes than how they deliver to the bottom line, and that environmentally focused, that's top of mind, what kind of legacy the company's leaving and how they prepare, do their products and stuff like that. We talked about honesty, transparency being critical attributes. And but the focus of our discussion was really how the conversation has changed over since the 80s, where it just kind of moved to Gordon Gecko and profit and stuff. And we really need to change that mentality and get back to what companies really their purpose is, how they can help.
Yeah, when they used to care about the communities they operated in. I mean, I've certainly seen that in Seattle, a real difference. They think of themselves as global communities and really, Boeing included, not care so much about Seattle. But I think, John, you make a really important point, which is that uh, we've got to have that shared consensus among everybody. Our investors, our employees, our vendors. I mean, the whole group of people that we've got to operate in, because if there's a disconnect, that pressure is not going to go away.
Yeah, right. It's always going to default back to what am I going to lose my job at the end of the day? Am I going to really do these other things?
Exactly, they're nice, is there? But it's pretty risky to think about doing that.
Yes.
If I stick my neck out as an early adopter about that, will I get it chopped off? So that's great. Let's get one more person in here. How about Daniel? Tell us what you meant by rational.
Um, it's kind of philosophical, but I think it's the issue of just being data driven and not just being driven completely by emotions, or which could lead to prejudice and unconscious bias. I think by being rational, and if it implies being data driven, you're being fair to everybody. I think that's what we're talking about. So both of us we're talking about the same thing. It's kind of like the golden rule applied, where we're just doing it um, fairly, as opposed to just selectively applying rules to when you feel like it.
Great, great. Okay, well, I'm sure that, as John said, we will continue this conversation and this evolution so we can all collectively feel safe and empowered to go to that next step. So let's go on to the Act Three, which is what if American business ownership looked like America? And this is a sneak preview of the research I'm about to publish. And in America, entrepreneurship and small business has been the job and innovation engine that fuels our economic growth, prosperity. And 99.7% of businesses are under 500 employees. At Haas, we specialize in growing large businesses. But in fact, once upon a time, Microsoft, Cargill, Unilever, they were all small businesses. But what we look as we unpack this, we know that small or startup but mighty businesses in America that have at least one employee. So there's 30 million businesses in the US, 6 million have at least one employee. They have actually created 2/3 of all net new jobs over the last 15 years. And despite the fact that they produce half of the US GDP. So they actually are punching above their weight. That is our sort of innovation engine that actually produces these big businesses. By the time you get big, and there's only 20,000 businesses in the US that are over 500 employees. The business is optimizing efficiency. They're looking to cut jobs rather than create more. So there are 60 million Americans that work for small or startup businesses, That's almost about half of working in the private sector. But here's the alarming trend: we are at an all-time low. Even before the pandemic, we are at an all-time low of business formation, and that is very, very troubling. Our engine, our innovation, and our business engine has stalled, um, because it's caught. We're caught up in this quick drawing. So what I did, I was asked to go back to the U.S. Senate for 6 months, and I looked at, okay, who's sitting on the sideline? Who could we catalyze to actually start businesses? So I said, okay, what if, does America look like, in terms of ethnicity and gender? And what would it take? So it turns out that if American business ownership did look like America, we would actually have 1.9 million more businesses. They would employ 19 million more Americans, and we would have an annual boost to our GDP of 20%. The last time we had that kind of boost is when we allowed women, or we encouraged women to get back into the workforce, sort of my generation, or for some of you who are younger, your mother's generation. That's been hugely beneficial. So I just want to show you real quick what that would mean in terms of doing it. If we continue on current trends, it will take about 200 years for us to have female ownership actually match their numbers in the workforce. For Hispanic or Latinx, about the same. We'll see some good news with respect to Asian American businesses, less so for Asian women. But for African Americans, it's actually 3,300 years it will take. And as I say, we fought the bloodiest war in America for freedom and opportunity over 150 years ago. We can do better than this. So let me just show you a quick thing. So let's look at California. These maps are what would it take and how close are we to looking like America. So in California, the female population is about half. They own about 19% of businesses. If we wanted to catalyze that, assuming, and this is for another day, but let me let you accept that there's actually as many women, Blacks, uh, Native Americans, Hispanics, and Asians who actually have the talent and tenacity and interest in starting these businesses. That's for another lecture. And so we're only at about 38% of this. And this is green is good and deep red is bad. Okay, so we look at Black or African American business owners, you'll see that this gets deeply red, with the exception of Missouri. I'll draw your attention to California once again. 3% of the California population is African American women. Only 0.4%, or only about 25 to 2,700 businesses are owned by African Americans in California. Hispanics or Latinx, you will see a deeply troubling map as well. For Asians, this is actually good news. Asians have been way more successful. They, I think, are really good at mentoring. But here's something that's not embedded in the numbers: Asian American businesses are still only half the size of the average small business in America. So we have a ways to go. And if you drop down, Asian females are not doing nearly as well. For American Indians and American Native Americans, it's a very mixed result, but certainly not for females. And for Native Hawaiians and other Pacific Islanders, this is deeply red. Now, this is a little bit of a small numbers problem, because you go to Minnesota, um, put this book, you go to Minnesota, and there's just very little numbers. There's only 48, and there's 16. So this Native Hawaiian and other Pacific Islanders suffers a bit from the data issue of that. So I just wanted to give you, this is going to be published on a public data that you'll be able to look. So we are starting businesses at a faster clip, but as I said, it's going to take a very long time. So I hope that you have found this conversation, whether you agree with it or not, thought provoking. I've appreciated you being here today. And let me just conclude with a stunning piece of art. So I will end with a stunning piece of art by a Cherokee Choctaw queer artist, Jeffrey Gibson. He was born to a Department of Defense engineer in Colorado. He stitched into this piece of the words of a raw and perceptive observer of America, James Baldwin. It says American history is longer, larger, more beautiful, and more terrible than anything anyone has ever said about it. What I hope is that maybe we can work together to create an America that is longer, larger, more beautiful, and less terrible than anything or anyone has ever said. And with that, I thank you very much for coming to this session and being part of the most thoughtful business leaders I know. And now I think we're going to turn it over for questions and conversation and debate.
We did have one question just come in. Maura, what are your thoughts on what is most effective in terms of change? Legislation, public sentiment, company grassroots, etc.
Well, I think at the end of the day, politicians always follow, not lead. I really believe that. And so I believe it's got to be, Mothers Against Drunk Driving was enormously successful in creating the ethos, changing the ethos. Same with smoking. Uh, you know, we got it to be socially unacceptable, and then we banned it in our workplaces and in every place else. So I think that public sentiment, but I also think that it's people are crying out for the company's business leadership. I do not think that underrepresented, people can by themselves seize the power and change. So it's not that I don't think legislation is important. I'm super excited about the initiatives that uh, President Biden and Kamala Harris are undertaking. But I think that our leaders only lead to the extent that we give them the privilege to do so. And so, it's not surprising that we will see more action by CEOs because 86% of their employees are saying, do something. And so I think that that's what's super important is that we as individuals speak up.
Great. Thank you for that. And Carly, did you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Sure, thank you. Maura, thank you so much for this lecture and the opportunity to discuss the topic as well. In your lecture, you mentioned the concept of ethnosphere and the benefit of that. I was wondering if you could give us more reference material to better learn about the associated benefit in that on that
Yeah.
topic.
So there's a fabulous book by Wade Davis called The Wayfarers, Wayfarers. And I told you I want his job in my next life, explorer in residence at National Geographic. But he is incredibly thoughtful. He also has great YouTube lectures on this issue. And so if you feel like you'd rather watch an hour-long YouTube lecture than read a book, you can do that. But he goes into this in great detail. He was asked to do a series of lectures, and that's actually what the Wayfarers book was a book length description of this. And I thought it was just really, really powerful.